There's one thing that has ended more civilizations than wars, coups, or foreign invasions. And it's not politics. It's not ideology. It's not even corruption. It's food. Not famine in the dramatic movie scene sense. Not empty shelves overnight. Something quieter. The moment when food stops feeling normal. When groceries suddenly feel tense. When prices change too fast to keep track of. When people start doing mental math in the supermarket and don't like the answer. Because here's the thing no one tells you clearly. People can survive bad governments. They can survive unfair systems. They can even survive wars. But when everyday food becomes uncertain, everything else breaks. Not emotionally, structurally. History shows this again and again. Long before people march in the streets, before slogans, flags, or revolutions, they first feel it here, at the table, at the market, at the checkout line. And what makes this uncomfortable is that it never feels dramatic at first. It feels small, annoying, temporary. Prices will come down. It's just supply issues. It'll stabilize soon. Until one day, people stop talking about politics altogether and start talking about bread. And once that happens, it's already too late. Because revolutions don't start with ideas. They start when daily life becomes impossible to ignore. And if you think this is just history, something distant, something abstract, then this video matters more than you think. If this already feels familiar to you, that's not a coincidence. Most people sense that something is wrong, but they can't quite explain it. You hear things like, everything feels more expensive, money doesn't go as far anymore. I don't understand how people are supposed to live like this. And usually, the conversation ends there. Because when people try to dig deeper, they're met with noise. Experts arguing on TV, headlines contradicting each other, charts that feel abstract, explanations that somehow never connect to real life. So people start assuming the problem is them. Maybe they're bad with money. Maybe they didn't plan well enough. Maybe they just don't understand economics. But here's the important part. That feeling of confusion is not a personal failure. It's shared, it's widespread, and it shows up in almost every society right before things snap. When systems become hard to understand, people don't usually rebel. They hesitate, they adapt, they doubt themselves. And that's why food prices matter so much. Not because people suddenly become political, but because food bypasses ideology. You can ignore headlines, you can tune out debates, you can scroll past charts, but you can't ignore the moment when feeding yourself starts requiring strategy. That's when confusion turns into something else. Not anger yet, not protest, just a quiet, unsettling question. Is this how it's supposed to be? And once that question starts spreading, the system is already under stress. If this already feels familiar to you, that's not a coincidence. Most people sense that something is wrong, but they can't quite explain it. You hear things like, everything feels more expensive. Money doesn't go as far anymore. I don't understand how people are supposed to live like this. And usually the conversation ends there. Because when people try to dig deeper, they're met with noise. Experts arguing on TV, headlines contradicting each other, charts that feel abstract, explanations that somehow never connect to real life. So people start assuming the problem is them. Maybe they're bad with money. Maybe they didn't plan well enough. Maybe they just don't understand economics. But here's the important part. That feeling of confusion is not a personal failure. It's shared, it's widespread, and it shows up in almost every society right before things snap. When systems become hard to understand, people don't usually rebel. They hesitate, they adapt, they doubt themselves. And that's why food prices matter so much. Not because people suddenly become political, but because food bypasses ideology.
You can ignore headlines, you can tune out debates, you can scroll past charts, but you can't ignore the moment when feeding yourself starts requiring strategy. That's when confusion turns into something else. Not anger yet, not protest, just a quiet, unsettling question. Is this how it's supposed to be? And once that question starts spreading, the system is already under stress.
Let's pause for a second, because this isn't as complicated as it sounds. You don't need an economics degree to understand what's happening. You don't need charts, equations, or insider knowledge. This follows a pattern, a very old one. And once you see the pattern, a lot of confusing things suddenly line up. We're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to argue ideologies, and we're not going to jump straight into revolutions. Instead, we're going to break this down in a simple way. 3 steps. First, why food prices matter more than almost anything else. Second, why governments consistently underestimate the danger. And third, why once food becomes unstable, everything else follows faster than anyone expects. That's it. No jargon, no drama, just structure. Because the mistake most explanations make is starting at the end. Riots, protests, revolutions, without explaining the pressure that built up long before anyone took to the streets. Food isn't just another price in the economy. It's the one thing people cannot delay, substitute, or ignore. You can postpone buying a house, you can cancel vacations, you can downgrade your lifestyle, but you can't negotiate with hunger. And that single fact changes how societies react when prices rise. So before we talk about history, or examples, or consequences, we need to understand one simple idea. Food prices don't just affect budgets, they affect behavior. Once that clicks, the rest of this story becomes disturbingly predictable. Most people think food prices rise for boring reasons. Bad harvests, supply chain issues, weather problems, a war somewhere far away. And sometimes, yes, those things matter. But here's the mistake almost everyone makes. They treat food inflation like any other economic problem, as if it behaves the same way as electronics getting more expensive, or fuel prices fluctuating, or housing cycles rising and falling. It doesn't. Food plays by different rules. When the price of phones goes up, people wait. When cars get expensive, people delay. When rent rises, people adapt, painfully but slowly. But when food prices rise, there's no waiting. People don't opt out of eating. They don't postpone it to next year. They don't replace it with patience. They feel it immediately, daily, multiple times a day. That's why rising food prices don't just create financial stress, they create emotional pressure, anger, fear, loss of control. And here's the part most explanations miss. It's not the percentage increase that matters, it's where the increase hits. Food inflation attacks the base of the pyramid, the people who already spend the largest share of their income just to survive. So even a small increase at the top of the system turns into a massive shock at the bottom. This is why governments consistently misread the danger. They look at averages, at indexes, at national statistics. But revolutions don't start in spreadsheets. They start when people feel cornered. And once that pressure builds around food, it doesn't stay economic for long. It becomes social, then political, then explosive. And the worst part? By the time leaders realize what's happening, it's usually already too late to reverse. Up to this point, this might still feel like something uniquely modern, like a flaw in today's system, like a consequence of recent decisions. But this pressure you're seeing, the way daily life becomes fragile long before politics explodes, that pattern is old, much older than modern governments, older than ideology, older than borders. Again and again, across different societies, something repeats. Before speeches turn angry, before protests turn violent, before regimes fall, food becomes scarce or suddenly unaffordable. Not luxury goods, not technology, not status. Food.
And when the most basic necessities start slipping out of reach, everything else changes. People don't radicalize because of ideas first. They radicalize because survival becomes uncertain. History doesn't move because people read new theories. It moves when daily life becomes intolerable. And this is the part most explanations skip. Wars don't usually start revolutions. Empty plates do. Once food prices break the sense of normal life, trust collapses fast. Not slowly, fast. That's the pattern. And it shows up long before flags fall or governments resign. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this pattern has repeated so many times before, what happened in the places where food prices spiraled first? That's where things start getting very specific. Once you know what to look for, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Take pre-revolutionary France. Before the crowd stormed anything, bread prices exploded. Wages didn't keep up. Daily meals turned into calculations, and anger didn't start in parliament, it started in kitchens. Or look at Russia before 1917. The trigger wasn't ideology at first, it was food shortages in cities. Long lines, empty shelves, a growing sense that the system couldn't even do the basics anymore. Jump forward again. In the Arab Spring, the first sparks weren't speeches about democracy, they were food prices. Grain costs rising faster than incomes, daily survival becoming uncertain. Different centuries, different cultures, same sequence. When food prices detach from ordinary income, pressure doesn't build slowly, it snaps. Because food isn't optional. You can delay buying a car, you can postpone moving, you can downgrade your lifestyle, but you can't negotiate with hunger. That's why food prices hit legitimacy faster than wars ever do. Wars feel distant at first. Food prices hit your life every single day. And once that daily pressure crosses a line, people don't ask for explanations anymore. They demand change. Which brings us to the part most systems underestimate. Because by the time food prices become the issue everyone talks about, the real damage has already been done.
What changed over time wasn't the outcome, it was the tools. In the past, food crises came from bad harvests, blockades, or physical shortages. Today, shelves are full, but affordability is what breaks. The pressure doesn't come from famine anymore, it comes from prices running ahead of income. Same stress, different mechanism. Instead of armies cutting supply lines, you get global markets, speculation, currency weakness, and policy decisions. Instead of empty granaries, you get full supermarkets that people quietly start avoiding. And that's what makes this phase more dangerous. Because visually, everything still looks normal. Lights are on, food exists, the system appears functional. But function isn't the same as access. When food becomes financially out of reach, the effect on society is almost identical to physical scarcity. Households adjust first. They downgrade, they skip, they stretch. Then resentment creeps in. Not loud at first, not ideological, just a growing sense that the basic contract is breaking. Because when people can't afford food without stress, they stop trusting the system that's supposed to provide stability. And once trust erodes at the most basic level, everything else becomes fragile. This is where the consequences stop being historical and start being structural. Because now the question isn't whether pressure builds, it's who absorbs it and who doesn't. When food prices rise, not everyone feels it the same way. Some people feel pressure. Others feel opportunity. Because higher prices don't hurt those who are closest to the system. Large producers can pass costs forward. Traders don't consume what they trade, they profit from volatility. Financial institutions don't fear instability, they price it. When prices swing, someone is always on the other side of that movement. And the closer you are to capital, information, and leverage,
the less food inflation feels like a crisis and the more it feels like a market condition. Governments benefit too, quietly. Higher prices mean higher tax intake. Inflation reduces the real weight of old debts. Pressure gets delayed, pushed forward, or absorbed elsewhere. No conspiracy, no villain monologue, just incentives doing exactly what incentives do. The system doesn't reward hunger, it rewards positioning. And when food becomes expensive, those positioned upstream barely notice, while those downstream absorb the shock. That difference matters, because once people realize that pain isn't shared equally, they stop seeing price increases as temporary. They start seeing them as unfair. And that's when economic pressure stops being economic and starts becoming social. Here's the part that's hardest to accept. Food prices don't trigger revolutions because people suddenly become irrational. They do it because food is the one cost you can't postpone. You can delay buying a car, you can delay moving, you can delay investing, but you can't delay eating. When food becomes unstable, everything else falls. That's why food pressure hits faster than unemployment, faster than housing crashes, faster than wars, because it reaches everyone every day without warning. And once people start feeling their basic survival is slipping in the breach, they stop arguing about policies and start questioning the system itself. What's uncomfortable is this. Most revolutions didn't begin with ideology, they began with social crises. Not slogans, not speeches, empty shelves, small portions, and the quiet realization that tomorrow might be worse than today. So here's the question that history keeps asking over and over. If food prices are rising at a high, wages aren't keeping up, governments keep saying it's temporary, at what point does economic pressure turn into something much harder to control? And more importantly, do you think modern societies are really immune to that pattern? Or have we just forgotten how it starts?